Erin, thanks for joining us today. We're so excited to have you on this latest episode of IDEI in our community. And welcome to the team. Uh,
Thank you.
the newest member of the team for
I know.
IDEI. So
It's
talk to
wild.
us just a little bit about your new role, how you got here, that entire process. I know it's
Yep.
been a journey,
Yes, it
especially
has
coming
been.
during COVID times. So
Yes.
talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I did not plan to make my first major career pivot during a pandemic, but there are so many things that none of us planned that have come to pass this year. And I spent the last 8 years working as a campus minister with a national ministry organization. And I had known for a year, I had told my friends, this is my last year. And then COVID hit. So I knew
Right.
I was on my way out. The sky was sort of the limit. So I do many things. I have 3 jobs right now, but I would say my overarching vocation, as it's becoming clear to me, is to midwife breakthrough in all of its forms. And that has been the phrase that really I felt like God gave to me and sort of spoke over my life, especially for this next season. And that has come to be in many ways. And this job is one of those ways that that's come to be. Um, I started getting involved in actual birth work a year ago. So I'm a birth doula. So outside of working at Providence, I work with clients across Rhode Island, Southeast Mass, pretty much anywhere within 2 hours. And I help folks prepare to birth babies. And then I get to go to births and then I get to help care for them in the postpartum. So I have all this sort of like floating around. I know I'm doing this doula work. I'm leaving full-time ministry. And then I meet Jackie Peterson on an airplane in January of 2020.
We might need to get into that story
We'll
because
need
every
to go
time I
back
hear
to
it, I'm just
that.
like, yeah, we
It's
might need
pretty
to.
wild. It's pretty wild. And uh, I was very nosy and I introduced myself because I saw her and just felt like she was someone I was supposed to meet. And we had this conversation on an airplane about institutions and can they ever be renewed or restored to their highest values? Can they be equitable for people? And we just started talking and she kind of became a mentor figure for me. And that led to this role. So we started meeting before the COVID times
Right,
on
right.
campus. And that was my first time ever visiting PC's campus, even though I've lived in Providence for a decade. So started to get to know the campus and I was looking for DE&I jobs, sort of. So as a white woman, getting into DE&I is super tender and complicated. And I never
Absolutely.
wanted to enter a space where I was either taking up space that someone of color should be having
Hmm.
or someone of really any other marginalized identity. But in the last couple of years, I've been doing a lot of white anti-racism work. So that
Yeah.
came about in my prior org. And that's been a sweet spot in all of the communities I'm a part of, is just kind of gathering my people and doing a lot of the deconstructing and reconstructing work. So she and I had been talking about that, and she had been sort of mentoring me about DE and I, and come to find out that there had been this work behind the scenes for LGBTQ inclusion and starting to make some significant moves as an institution. And in our conversations that came up of, oh, have you done LGBTQ work? And yeah, as a matter of fact, that's been like a core part of my life for most of my
Yeah,
life. So
absolutely.
that's sort of
Yeah.
where this led.
Yeah, and it's funny because at PC we'd call that divine providence, right? That the
Yes,
idea of,
yes, yes.
just it already kind of being written in the stars, so to speak, to end up at PC. And so just really, excited to really think through, what is next and what you have aspirations for in this new role. I know it's obviously unique and it has an interesting sort of partnership as well
Yeah,
with
yeah.
mission and ministry and just obviously it's early on in your time at PC. I think it's been a couple of weeks, but kind of talk to us about just some of the aspirations, the hopes, where you see this going, your partnership. Spill it
Yeah,
all.
absolutely, absolutely. So I'm really honored to be working with Professor Dillon in the theology department. And Professor Dillon's going to be our theological praxis coordinator. So starting in January, she'll be co-chairing this process with me. And I think something for PC is that as an institution, we haven't had that conversation in sort of consistent ways about the complicated the complicated reality that the church has its teachings on sexuality and human sexuality and flourishing, which are beautiful for many, but can often be really inequitable for LGBTQ people. So how do we live in the tension of these things, of the church's teaching that would offer celibacy, which can be so freeing for some, but then can feel like chains for others? And then how do we actually have a campus that's hospitable and inclusive for queer folks, staff, students, and faculty? So Dr. Dillon is this theological expert who's going to help put voice to where the institution has always been, but maybe the conversations that we haven't faithfully had. And then I come in from this diversity perspective around rights and dignity and consistency, and a desire that we reduce harm as an institution to LGBTQ folks who are here and who will come and who want to be a part of this campus in a meaningful way. And maybe they have a variety of different theological beliefs, but what does it mean to be at a Catholic and Dominican institution? And then how do we meet in the middle of what has been a culture war for decades?
Absolutely. And one thing that for me, I'm always excited to have new teammates, but also just in this particular role, knowing that it's so impactful and so important is that consistency, right? It's oftentimes these conversations come in waves, right? It might have a wave or a season a couple years ago, and then it might just die down. And so to really sort of see that intentional planning and that effort from Jackie, the entire college, truthfully, to really tackle it head on, because, we are, we know where we can go, and it requires that work, right? And it doesn't come without that struggle, that tension, that middle ground, or whatever that might be, to come to this space where we are really that inclusive environment that we want to be on all fronts.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. And I think housing that in a position is significant. And I hope that the college takes note. It's new territory for the college. And my position is temporary. It's 1 year to try to midwife this process. And then the hopes of this process, working with Professor Dillon, is that all the stakeholders in play and folks who really care about this on campus have a voice in shaping what the role of a full-time LGBTQ coordinator would look like. And if someone owns that in their job, that says a lot for the college's commitment to inclusion. And it says a lot for this remaining consistent and remaining on the table and in different levels in res life, and where do we house students, and how do we make sure that they feel safe in mental health counseling, and our amazing counselors here being equipped so that they can provide contextualized care for LGBTQ folks. There's so many different ways that an institution can become more loving and more hospitable. So,
absolutely. And one of the things that, I'm really grateful for, and I think about a lot in your role and just the work that you're doing, oftentimes this comes at the expense of students, right? Oftentimes that activist work to create a more inclusive environment, especially for LGBTQ folks, is students really pushing that. And it's refreshing in some ways to now have this position and this role to kind of take that load off, right? And we know that when we're in this work of creating inclusive environments, it often comes at the disproportionate labor of marginalized identities, right?
That's right.
And so how can we start to do this on the other side, right? We shouldn't have to have superheroes as students.
No, it's a totally unfair burden. And that's, I hope that that's a place that we as a college can own, that's not okay, that students bear that brunt. At the same time, I'm a participant in community organization and organizing efforts in Providence. I'm a mini activist in my own right. And I think I strongly believe that it takes all modalities and all forms of organizing. So I hope that students never lose their voice of holding the college accountable to its values and ideals. And I want there to be systemic positions and roles and ownership, on different levels for LGBTQ inclusion and
Absolutely.
care.
It's funny, you must have read my notes, because I was just about to ask, you've been in Providence for over a decade, your involvement within the community. And so, you touched on it a little bit, but can you talk to me about just the ways in which your work in the community shapes what you do now, and how you hope to bring that work into this role? Because I think even particularly with what you're tasked to do, community involvement and community influence will be so impactful and can really shape the direction of the work that you're doing.
Yep. So from the outset, I don't feel comfortable calling myself an ally or any other form of solidarity as a term, only because I sit in one of the most privileged bodies in our society. So for me, in my anti-racism work and in my LGBTQ inclusion work, I will be called whatever those who are most marginalized wish to call me and acknowledge. So that feels really important to me in the tenor in which we start this work, is that those who have the most historical power and privilege don't get to make ourselves feel like we're doing a good job, if that makes sense. We answer to the reality of the bodies of those who are most historically marginalized, and is their lived experience changing and getting better. And that's come out in so much of the work that I'm a part of the white anti-racism work I've been doing in Christian circles. There's a really strong charge that Martin Luther King wrote from the jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama, when he wrote the famed letter from a Birmingham jail. And he makes this call to the white moderate, sort of calls out the white moderate and says, actually, it's not the KKK. It's not the most extreme versions of violence that trouble me. It's the folks who are willing to settle for a negative peace that trouble me and are willing to not press through to wanting true justice and equity. And I teach that work and I study that work. I probably read that letter like 3 times a year and just try to sit in it for my own accountability. And a part of the many circles that I'm in the community, it's that we all have work to do. And I think especially more so those who are in the majority and who have had historical power and privilege have more work to do. But that often isn't the case. Often it's the most marginalized that are doing the organizing, the protesting. So a couple of things I'm involved with in the city. My husband and I and our 2 kids, we live in the south side of Providence. We love this side of the city, but it's not a side of the city that is going to show up on a cute postcard when they like map out the neighborhoods of Providence. It's not going to show up in any kind of like tourism material from the little city hall pamphlets. The south side is largely overlooked. It houses historically the Latinx neighborhood. It's Dominican, it's Puerto Rican, it's mostly immigrant community. It's a super interesting neighborhood. Used to be wealthy white. So you have all these like Victorian era mansions. Then it was historically Black. And then white flight happens. Black folks are intermingling with Latinx immigrants, and there's all sorts of tensions in the neighborhood. And now it's like 60 or 70% Latinx in our neighborhood. So for us, we believe as people who love Jesus and are sort of faithful followers of Jesus that we believe in a theology of place, which means that a lot of the shape of our life as a white family living in the South Side has everything to do with advocating and being in solidarity with our neighbors who are pressing up against issues of affordable housing. So right now we're in all sorts of meetings about a abandoned church on our corner that a sort of gentrifying developer wants to buy and turn into like bougie micro lofts. So like our work looks like participating in that and in pushing back against those powers. Our work also looks like supporting DARE, which is an awesome org, low-income people of color who are mobilizing for low-income people of color. They've done a lot of work with incarceration, getting the little box. Sorry, my son keeps coming in my face.
No, you're good.
They've banned the box in Rhode Island that says, I was formerly incarcerated. That becomes such a barrier for folks coming out of the prison system into employment. So there's a few different orgs that we participate in and we march with. There was some really uncalled for police violence in our city against a young man named Jamal Gonzalez a couple weeks ago. And we were out there with our 2-year-old and our 4-year-old in 8 p.m. with our friends and their kids marching to the police headquarters and saying, this is not okay. So that's a part of the shape of our life. And I share that because I think that it helps anyone watching to locate me as a person. So I'm a Providence community member, I'm a mom, and I'm someone who participates in a Christian way, I would say in trying to live a life that challenges the empire.
Yeah.
We live in a silo in the States. I grew up overseas, and um, we live in a silo in the States where here Christians believe they're persecuted. And I can just say from being in other countries, this is just not
Right.
true.
You're right.
Christians and
Context is
white
so important.
Christians have
Right.
power.
Yeah.
They have a lot of power here, unhealthy power. And I believe that to stay faithful to the teachings of Jesus, we have to be really, really discerning about power and our proximity to it. The Bible has a lot to say about the love of God and the love of money being incompatible. So those are things that Chris and I, my husband, are really trying to like wrestle with and take to heart in the shape of our life. So,
and you know what I think, when I hear you talk a lot, I think that you're someone that that pushes the need for being comfortable with the uncomfortable. I know that's a phrase we use all the time, but I think, and both the work that you're tasked with and how you embody what you do, right? There's a real recognition of how can we continue to challenge those things that we might not necessarily resonate with, or that might not always sit with us naturally, right? How can we continue to do that? And I envision that you're probably trying to bring that to the work as well, right?
Totally.
As far as pushing that and leveraging your own positionality and your own identities and all of that to push that forward.
Yep. I think what often happens, what I've noticed happen in Catholic and Christian spaces that have a historical view on sexuality that is, it's a valid view among many views in the world of what it means to be human and how we're supposed to honor each other. But what can often happen is our theology becomes a barrier to our proximity to people on the other side of our theologies. And that is where we have to keep fighting against our own complacency to not break bread with folks who are radically different than us in their gender identity, their sexual identity, their economic level. That's what I love about Jesus and sort of keeps me faithful to Jesus to this day, is that the table he set was very long and there was room for everyone. And that doesn't mean that he didn't have specific teachings to people about how to live and what do we do with the shape of our lives. But that table was set really, really wide. So I think for me, as I enter into PC, I hold the tension of respect for the Catholic and Dominican identity and wanting to, understand and to learn, and also a deep desire to see LGBTQ students honored and dignified, and also that there's something for hetero and cis folks to learn from queer folks. It's not only that we would create space in our communities for them, but what is it about the shape of their life and the nuances of the marginalization that they have faced that shape how they see the world, how they see God, how they see the kingdom of God. There are so many conversations that we can have that are really fruitful and community building, but we have to address the ways that we've fallen short and we've hurt one another and we don't totally know how to coexist in the same space. So.
Yeah. And as someone who's, grown overseas, that idea of sort of reconciliation and just kind of owning and naming the parts of our past that have been troubling, I think is something that it sounds like you're very eager to do and bring to the work, really putting a name to it. And to sort of kind of tie this thought in with, what we've just been talking about, how does this particular time period, obviously we talked about COVID, but just from a social unrest perspective and just our almost reckoning with our history, right? To be blunt, right? How do you think that has shaped or influenced your work? And also just how do you hope it will shape and direct your work moving forward? I think we're all in this DEI space recognizing that where we are in this time period has had a profound impact on what we're doing presently and where we're going. And so I'm wondering from your perspective, how has this time done that for you?
It's interesting. I've been on my own anti-racism journey for probably like 10 years of active, like researching and learning and wrestling. When George Floyd was murdered, when the Breonna Taylor was murdered, like all the things that happened this summer in our country flared up, and sort of, I think, and I guess I want to make clear, whenever I talk about injustice, for me, it's all intersecting. So when I talk about anti-racism, I'm also thinking about Black trans lives. I'm thinking about all the different intersections of those who are, as Howard Thurman would say, historically have their backs against the wall. So when all that comes to bear, I feel complicated because on the one hand, it holds up a mirror to our culture. And honestly, I feel like that's what the last 4 years of this particular presidency has done, is hold up a mirror. I think some people would like to say this is extreme and this is not who we are. But I think I would say soberly, yeah, this is who we are. This is who we've been historically. This is what happens when you don't, to use Christian language, you don't repent. We haven't named what we've done. White folks have not nationally apologized for slavery, let alone make financial reparations for it. I grew up in Austria, which is in the shadow of World War II. So over there, the monuments that are all over the country are not to Nazi soldiers. The monuments are to those who were murdered and those Jewish people who underwent horrors that we cannot imagine. So to me, honestly, from a Christian perspective, what's happening right now is our idols are being challenged in our country. And the way we respond to that reveals, I think, what and who we really worship. So I see homophobia tied in with all of that, transphobia tied in with all of that. And I think in some ways the church is more ready to engage with racism, but our homophobia feels like this untouchable subject that we're not ready to engage with. And I want to offer that they go hand in hand in some ways. There's so much nuance, but like God is big enough to hold these tensions and to hold us as we have these conversations. And I guess because I have seen and lived in other countries where that kind of public repentance has happened, I also think about Rwanda, and South Africa even, and truth and reconciliation committees that happened. Like there have been these horrific things that have happened in other nations where, I'm not saying that any of these resolutions are perfect, but at least they've named it and they've apologized for it and they've made financial restitution for it. So yeah, it feels like that's what needs to happen if we're going to see the wounds really heal that allow us to move forward together.
Yeah, so. You bring up, so many good points. And one of the things that I really think was really stood out to me is just continuing to think about the intersection of all these things in the work, right? I think oftentimes we're comfortable naming things around police brutality, but we don't want to see that as it intersects with socioeconomic status or with homophobia or gender discrimination. I mean, there's so many ways in which all these isms intersect with each other. And totally. I think one thing that I am excited about, just to kind of in some ways pivot it back to PC, is that I think we started to build a bit of an infrastructure to look at it through that lens, right? Through that intersectional lens. So it's not just this one thing, it's all of these things, how they interweave and how they play out in different times and different periods. And I think to me, that gives me great hope and excitement, both as someone who works in the DEI office, but even more importantly, as an alum, right? Yes, so for me, thinking about, where we're headed, as someone who went here, it makes me more excited because I think that's really important for us to continue to grow.
Yep. I think I would be remiss in this little interview if I didn't honor the labor of queer students on this campus for generations. I say part of the reason I'm here is because I met Jackie on an airplane, but a real part of the reason, the reason that I'm here is because of the faithful and very courageous organizing efforts of students affiliated with Shepherd and not, and staff and faculty who have really courageously been out in a community that doesn't always feel welcoming and often feels maybe hostile. So I just want to honor that and name that. And also that from my observation, what I think is pretty amazing is that Shepherd has had one of the most diverse exec boards in its history. And I think it's an interesting time of me coming on campus and interacting with them, because my thinking is that, to borrow a biblical metaphor, the wineskins that we can build together with mission and ministry, this particular generation of Shepherd, DE and I being on this campus for a couple of years, with those intersections, that actually creates a much more equitable path forward than if it was if it was homogeneous with ethnicity, but diverse with sexual identity and gender identity, right? Then we're only hitting one level of the way that students are marginalized on campus. But I think the beautiful diversity of who's on campus today and who is in the mix today makes me really hopeful for what could be built here. But it's going to take a lot of work on teasing out who we are as a campus and what we believe about human flourishing. How do we translate the historical teaching of the church to this context, and how do we create spaces where those conversations are happening, So I'm really hopeful about that. But yeah, we'll see how everyone can enter in. And I think also what I'm asking folks to do is hard in a time when we're virtual and it's a pandemic and there's a lot going on. And I think that's what, honestly, as a white person, that's what it can feel to us who've been, the way I describe it in the white affinity spaces I lead is that we have really weak muscles and really small calluses in this area, because we have not dealt with oppression in this way. We've not ever been in the one down position. I think the fact that I'm a woman, I can relate on that level, but that means that our stamina for conversations, change, policy initiatives is incredibly low. That's not okay. And I'm not excusing that at all. It's just reality. Our calluses are low, our muscles are weak for it. It's why, we brought Robin DeAngelo in this year about white fragility and discussing that's not a dig at white people. It's just reflecting reality, that because we've never been in this position in this country, we have no idea what it takes to stay at the table in these conversations. So
and it's an interesting thing that you say that in different affinity spaces. One of the things I always say is continue to stay engaged. Right. You have the option to not be engaged. You can choose not to, but I'm imploring you, right, for both the benefit of all, for the benefit of me, right, and my identity and the folk that I love, to continue to stay engaged and to choose that work. And it can be difficult and you can opt out, but that's not what, as we talk about real sort of systemic change, our goal really is to have folk continually opt in. And I think that's where we're starting to build that up.
I want to read this passage. I was trying to find it. Yeah. So for me, yes, stay at the table. I feel like if anyone should have the inner and divine motivation to do this, it's those who claim Christ. So the Catholic identity of this college rests on the teachings of the church and the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth, who said, and I just want to read it, in quoting Isaiah, when he stands up in this moment and sort of announces his ministry right at the beginning and says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." That is Jesus's mission statement at the beginning of his ministry. That's our call. Even, of course, not everyone in our community claims a Christian identity, but by being at a Catholic college, that's the foundation of this place. So if something keeps white folks and hetero folks and cisgendered folks at the table, it ought to be the call of Jesus, who emptied power from himself to dwell with us and to partner and co-create with us, and is here for the liberation of all people. So feels like we've got hope in that's the bedrock. That's an agreed upon claim that this college sits on,
Yeah. And it's funny. I mean, we could do this for hours, and even just looking at my notes, it's like, my last question is, what are the hopes for the college, right? And so, I mean, just as you said, right, just really living in that, and really kind of utilizing that as the framework for what we can do. I think oftentimes the work can seem antithetical, right? The work of, our theology and the work of DEI sometimes can seem like they're at opposing ends, but really, in truth, done properly and done with intention and effort can really be a really great path forward, and give us a really powerful way forward. And I think that's kind of as we sort of think through where it is that we want to go. And I can't speak for everybody, but I really feel like that is at the core of where we're trying to go, and wrestling with that and really getting to that spot. And it won't be easy, right? But that's why we have fantastic teammates like you, and the entire squad of folk.
It's an amazing team. Holy moly. I'm so honored to sit on this team.
Well, we are glad that you are with us. I don't want to leave. If there is anything else that you feel like we might have missed, I feel like we could do this all day, and we should.
It's true.
And we should. But if there's anything else,
I just think that I use that metaphor that comes from the New Testament. The Gospel is wine and wineskins, and just to explain that a little more, is that Jesus is telling a parable about using these sort of ancient go-tos that would make sense for people at the time that we have to translate now, but that if you pour new wine into an old wineskin, the wineskin bursts because it's not ready for all the chemical properties of that new wine, and it's been used. It's old. And so Jesus says we need new wineskins to house new wine, and was always reminding us that the way the Spirit of God works is birth, death, and resurrection over and over and over again. That's like the mark of God, is that God is always doing a new thing. And so the way that translates on for me with my justice work, whether it's racism or homophobia, it's that the wineskins, the structures of our society are broken. We know that. And they, in their current form, can't hold the new thing that God is doing. And so this process over the next year is about addressing the wineskins and seeing, are we ready for new wine? And that won't mean for PC a new reading on church teachings. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a new way of participating together in community. In light of these teachings, can we be more radically hospitable? Can we really assign dignity? Is there a way for people to move and have their being on this campus that it has integrity for them, and can be authentic for them? So that's a part of it, I think, is that this process, the truth of it is we'll only go as far as PC's ready to go, as the whole community can move together to go. And that's what we see in pretty much every justice issue, is that that's why every single modality of, the folks who are agitating the system, it's so good and it's so needed. The folks who work within the system, who are making incremental changes over decades, all these things matter to keep pace with what God is doing. So just wanted to offer that explanation of these churchy things.
Well, I certainly do appreciate it. I think all our viewers and all our listeners will. Erin, it has been such a pleasure. And we hope that you will join us again on IDEI in our community. There's just so much that we can continue to do, continue to
absolutely
grow in. And so again, I'm grateful for the work you're doing as my teammate in IDEI, but again, just on the behalf of the college and just as an alum, I truly appreciate you, and
Thank you.
Really looking forward to all the work that you have.
Thank you so much. You've been so welcoming, and I really appreciate it. Everyone has been, and I'm just excited to get to know this place as sort of a sojourner who will be with you for a while. So Thank you.
All right. Sounds good.
Bless you.